So yeah, the ceiling on Burks is really nice. I don't think that enough people are talking about the floor. And maybe it's just like a little taboo to just like talk about like what could happen to these guys. But it's like, yeah, like, you know what, like athletically, like he does look a lot like N'Keal Harry.
Welcome back to Establish the Edge. I am your host, Mike Leone. I know it's been a little while since we had an episode. Took a break, took a little vacation post NFL season and getting our best ball rankings out. But now we're in the full swing of the off season with free agency going on, NFL draft around the corner. So you can expect about 1 to 2 podcasts per week. Really, I think, leading up to the start of the NFL season from Establish the Edge. So I'm excited for that. We've got some good episodes on tap in this week's episode. I've got Anthony Amico joining me to talk wide receiver prospects. We'll talk his general approach to prospects, what matters, what doesn't matter, and then go through some specific prospects and how we should value them in Dynasty. Next week, I will have Pat Crane on to kind of continue the theme of wide receiver prospects and look at the year 2 guys in the NFL and maybe do some comparisons to this year's rookie class, and hoping to get Mark Dankenbring and or Jack Miller, who have been helping me with the off-season best ball rankings and projections for ETR on a podcast soon, especially once free agency concludes and we have a little bit more of a picture on these teams. We'll do a podcast as to what's sticking out to us. But without further ado, Anthony Amico, welcome to the show and the first episode of really the 2022 NFL season for Establish the Edge.
Love that. I get to be the first guest in 2022. It's cool, man. Thanks for having me. Love talking draft, love talking prospects. So this is going to be fun.
Yeah. Anthony and I were talking before the show. I used to have a Buffalo Bills podcast, Homer Alert, and first podcast him and I ever did together was talking wide receiver prospects. And Amico heads up our dynasty rankings over at Establish the Run. They're in our draft kit. You can get them draft kits extremely cheap. And he's got a lot of good articles up. He's got some prospect profiles and a lot of the stuff we're covering today. He's got covered even further in depth on site. So check out Establish the Run if you want to see that. In general, though, Amico, your approach to receivers and, kind of figuring out your prospect models and your rankings for Dynasty, there's so much information out there. I guess, how do you whittle it down to what matters and what doesn't matter?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a pretty broad question, right? I would say like there's basically 3 things that I care about, right? Like I care first of all about the statistical profile. I guess to like a certain extent, I'm rechecking every year, like to just verify like what stats are important. And I want to make sure, I want to see like who has the stat profiles that matter to us. Specifically, we're talking about things like breakout age, dominator rating, stuff like that. All stuff you can check out, of course, on the site. I want to know like what the scouts are saying. Like there's a handful of guys that I'd say I really key into the most: Daniel Jeremiah, Dane Brugler, Lance Zierlein. Like I think those are like 3 of the best guys out there. I really try to not read like a million scouting reports because then you end up getting too many different opinions. I think that those guys are really good, so I focus on them. And then I'd say the third thing is just like what the NFL is telling us, like which we don't know yet, and we'll find out when the draft comes. But basically, where are these guys being drafted? Where are they slotting in? When all 32 teams are on the clock. So I think, obviously we have, I would say most of the first 2 things kind of set away for now. And that's really what we're analyzing mostly in the profiles and stuff like that on the site. And then, in a little bit over a month, 6 weeks, we'll get that NFL component, and then we can really kind of finalize a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. And I've always appreciated the way that you are open to, including the scouting in your wide receiver prospect modeling, because I know, some people are kind of like on, 2 sides of a coin. They're either film guys or they're, just straight by the numbers. And you've sort of found ways to include the scouting in your models without having to watch the film yourself, just understanding that is something that does provide some signal. We shouldn't be completely ignoring that. So, so I guess maybe start there as far as scouting. And I guess I'll include like, combine athletic testing in that, players' physical attributes, and then, some of the subjective opinions of people that you respect, you're kind of like, how are you including that? And, what are you looking for as far as, some athletic testing or physical attributes?
Yeah. So it's actually kind of funny because like when I was first modeling all of this stuff, like I was just including like a straight ranking. NFL Draft Scout was like at the time like really reliable source. Like they were updating stuff constantly, and it was all free. I'm pretty sure a bunch of their stuff is paywall now. So I like literally was just throwing those rankings into the model, and it was like really greatly like improving the predictability of the outcomes, which was really nice. So I think like just on its own, there's real true statistic evidence that would just say like, oh, like this actually is important. So even if you're, I think like a pretty numbers driven person, which I usually try to be, like that's stuff that you have to factor in. Now, like the stuff that I'm putting on the site in terms of like the player comps and stuff like that, like that's not really including that. So that's more of like context that we're layering in. But I think something that's really important is just like understanding where players win and how that matches up maybe with the athletic profile also. So, like if someone runs like a 4.5, but everything in their scouting report says like they win on deep balls, that's not really good, right? Like that doesn't really line up to how they are going to win, or like they're not going to be able to win that way in the NFL with that kind of speed, right? So then you're like, okay, this is bad, stuff like that. So I like to have an idea kind of like how these players can be successful.
Yeah. And once we get into specific prospects, there are a couple guys where it's not necessarily clear, even among the top guys, like exactly how they're going to win or how, it'll translate to the NFL level, which is interesting this year. But I like that you include the scouting, having in the past just thrown that scout rank in there. I don't think people realize, like, just getting nerdy with model building, sometimes like qualitative and subjective information can still be, quantified. The value can still be quantified. You could throw anything in a model. Like we could throw in which players we think have the most heart in a model. And, it's, like you could do it, whether it's going to come out predictive or not, we'll see, but you'll be able to isolate that variable and the impact that it has. As far as the production you're looking at, you mentioned dominator rating, breakout age. Why don't you go into a little bit more depth, like explaining what those are and why they're important?
Yeah. So dominator rating is something that comes from work that Fantasy Douche and Sean Siegel did, years ago, looking at receiver production as a product of like what the team is doing instead of just the raw totals. So, share of receiving yards, share of receiving touchdowns as a percentage of the total team results in the games that the player played. So, Dominator just averages those two numbers together. So when we're talking about breakouts, or at least when I'm talking about breakouts, I'm talking about a player who achieved a 30% Dominator rating in a given season. Over the years, that's basically proven to be like the predictive threshold or a threshold that, tells us that in the future, this player has a chance to be pretty successful. Now, some of the stuff that we've been looking at on the site and that people have looked at in the past is just like, when this breakout occurs, does that help us tell if this player can be good at the next level or not? And the overwhelming answer has been yes. If players are breaking out younger, or I think even more specifically with some of the stuff that I've looked at over the last couple of years, like if they're breaking out earlier in their collegiate careers, that is extremely good. If we're just setting like an arbitrary threshold of 15 PPR points, like if we're looking for a receiver who's going to average 15 PPR points within his first 3 seasons in the NFL, 31% of players who broke out as a true freshman, their first year in college, were able to achieve that threshold. Like that's a really high number when we're especially talking about football, like people being able to be successful and being good at the next level. So like the breakout stuff is really good. I mean, we basically break it down to 3 different groups on the site. A player who has played 3 years in college only, that's inclusive of any redshirt years, 34% hit rate. Players who broke out in year 1 or year 2 and played more than 3 seasons, 10% hit rate. And all other players, which is basically like you didn't break out at all, or you broke out after year 3 and played longer than 3 years, 2% hit rate. So you can see that there's like a tremendous difference in the results on just this one metric. So, some of that stuff is obviously baked into draft position, but even if you start layering some of that stuff in, you still have some really big differences in results.
Yeah, the age of the prospects, we've seen matters a ton. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Like the difference between, a 19-year-old and a 20-year-old, like at that point, those age differences are pretty big. So if you're able to be successful and a true breakout, like dominant player at a younger age, it's more important. And you mentioned like 3-year players, like not just the breakout age, but like prospects that declare early versus prospects that don't declare early. I think that's one of the things I've seen the past few years is the analytics community has really seen like, okay, the guys that play all 4 years in college and don't declare early, it's not that they're drawing dead, but that's a big red flag against them. We always want to be nuanced and take into account context, but it's really important that we start with the base rate, which is if you didn't declare early, your odds of being, a productive player at the NFL level drop significantly. I know some prospects that we used to love historically, like Corey Davis was an analytics darling. And had we been more keen on, seeing that he didn't declare early, like that's something that, I'm not saying he wouldn't have projected well because he would have, no matter what, but he's just a good example of like that extra context and knowing that we might have been a little more cautious than we were, which was like abundantly optimistic on a guy like that previously.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think the experience point is important to note also, just because like player age is like not really ultimately in these guys' control, right? Like sometimes they have later birthdays, or depending on what state they come from, like the cutoff to like be enrolled at a certain age, changes. So like you see this year, we have a bunch of 3-year guys. Like Drake London is a 3-year player and he's 20. Treylon Burks, Garrett Wilson, like they're also 3-year guys, but they're 21. So we're not like, all things being equal, like we still prefer the guy to be younger, but we're not going to like penalize a guy for being a year older if they have the same level of experience.
Yeah. And, if you are looking for exceptions, what are you looking for? Like Devonta Smith, he wasn't an early declare, right? Like was he?
Not an early declare. Devonta Smith was just like an incredible outlier. Like he was a little bit older. He was a 4-year player.
But he was good when he was young, right? Even though he played all 4 years, or do I not have that right?
He was okay. Like the thing is just that like Alabama had just all these studs, so he wasn't doing a ton. Like his 3rd year, he was doing a lot, and I think people expected that he would have been a first-round pick if he had just declared then. So when he came back, it was kind of weird. But then he won the Heisman, like he just went like totally nuclear, and it was like, okay, well, how do you really hold that against him?
Right. And well, I'm glad you brought up the Alabama teammates things, because that is one of, sometimes when I see analytics prospects Twitter, some of the debates they have is how much like outside context should we use? Because there's some people that are like, okay, if they don't hit these strict thresholds for breaking out at a certain age, or percent of team yards and whatnot, some people will cross them off. They don't really care.
Yeah.
They think the context is just noise and you're, doing a disservice. I think we like to think that, we want to stick to the base rate, but there are some exceptions. Alabama's just been absolutely loaded at wide receiver the last few years. So we've seen that a few times with some of their guys the past few seasons. This year with Ohio State, like they've got a bunch of guys there. And, last year, one of the guys we liked was Terrace Marshall. And there was definitely some of that going on with him, where we were accounting for the fact that he played with Justin Jefferson, played with Jamar Chase. And when he didn't, then his numbers were a lot better. So how do you go about adding that context in, without like, it's hard because you don't want to be too micro focused on that specific player when you have these hit rates overall based on thresholds. But at the same time, like we're trying to do the best we can to get as many people right as possible. And if that means having an active hand in some players and not just looking at the pure numbers, we're going to do that.
Yeah. I think actually like it really helps us. Like I know it kind of like muddles the picture a little bit, because you're not going to get the same statistical profiles on these guys that you would if they just played for like, I don't know, Pittsburgh or something. But it's nice to have something to fall back on and be able to say like, oh, like this player, player X outproduced player Y, and player Y is already like very good or something, like I think the LSU thing is actually kind of funny because, Ja'Marr Chase and Justin Jefferson did have that season together. Justin Jefferson was a first-round pick. He was amazing as a rookie. And then we had Ja'Marr Chase, who like was so good the year that they played together that he was even better than that guy,
Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, like that's probably a pretty good sign, Like I think last year we had also like Jalen Waddle. He was kind of like on and off the field because he had some injuries. But like the games that he played with Devonta Smith, like he was like neck and neck with Devonta Smith. We're like, okay, like this guy's production profile actually could have been, really good. So I like having kind of that information. I think it allows us to see a little bit more about, because ultimately we don't really know, right? Like we don't really know who some of these guys are. So if you have a teammate that you can draw a little context from, I think that's actually probably beneficial to us. But yeah, it is always interesting to look back at some of these profiles and you're like, all right, well, like, yeah, his traditional numbers don't line up, but I mean, you have to include some of this stuff. Like the whole point of market share is comparing it against your team. So like naturally, if you have like incredible teammates, that's going to impact you. So yeah, like most of the time when I'm looking at it, it's I guess it's pretty subjective. I know like JJ Zacharyson has like inputs in his models that include some of that stuff. I haven't really found out like a way to do that I like yet, but I guess I could just ask him. But but yeah, like I think if you're accounting for it, that's generally going to make you more accurate.
Yeah, one thing both you and JJ, you can check out his stuff at lateround.com. He has a prospect guide up, but you guys both use yards per team pass attempt a decent bit, which I like because it's kind of this, and I mean dominator rating, like it's all kind of like very similar, but it's a combination of volume and efficiency. Like if you're earning a lot of targets, your yards per team pass attempt is going to be high. If you're efficient on those targets, it's going to be even higher. So it's sort of a good way to catch all both efficiency and your ability to earn volume and earn targets at the same time.
Yeah, it's definitely the best stat to me, I think. I mean, like, I think with some of the market share stuff, there's like a point where you're just not really seeing any improvement. Like once you get past like that dominator threshold of 30% or even like 40%, like it's not like if a guy has like a 50% dominator, that means that he's going to be really good. Like we haven't really seen that. But like receiving yards per team pass attempt, like there is generally like a better trend. Like as the number goes up, like the player's probably a little better.
And that makes sense because it's like, let's just say your teammates are all horrific and like those targets are like super inefficient. Like it's going to make your dominator rating look better, but that doesn't mean you're successful. Whereas the yards per team pass attempt, as you said, like it's a bit more continuous. So last thing before we get on to the specific prospects for this year, do you care at all about like archetype? Like how much do you care about archetypes? Like small slot wide receiver versus, big, tall, prototypical outside receiver. Like, do you care at all? Or are you just like, I want to see this level of production and athleticism. And, if they hit these thresholds, they're going to get done how they're going to get done. Like I'm on Russ St. Brown with someone that we weren't really on, but like he's like more of a slot guy, like not your like big, winner in terms of on the outside.
Yeah. I mean, I think it matters. Like I want to know. I don't have like I don't have a way that I'm like accounting for this in like a measured sense, but like you want to know, like, I think it's part of building the profile. Like it's part of building the range of outcomes. Like guys who are like this, do this, like someone who is like a pure speed guy. Those are players that I think typically tend to be like really valuable in real life, but like maybe aren't as valuable in fantasy, even if they're really good. Because they're just not typically catching as many passes or scoring as many points. The slot guys, like maybe they're a little more quarterback dependent. The big guys, like they can score more touchdowns. We love touchdowns. And then like even more. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, just to your point about the comps, like you've got Treylon Burks comps and all the prospect profiles you have up. You've got like the most similar prospects and their comps. So it does make sense in that regard. And I was just thinking in my head, like it's kind of hard to, like at a certain point, a guy we wouldn't care about the archetype. Like if he's putting up a certain level of production, like small slot wide, like, and we'll
Right.
talk about some of these guys as we get into the individual prospects. Let's jump to Burks. Actually, you have Burks. I believe you have him 1, or no, you have London.
Yeah, we moved London ahead of him in the last update.
Last update, London leapfrog Burks. Let's start with Burks because he's interesting. He's not getting a ton of respect in terms of the odds of being the first wide receiver selected. I think what you say was like 9-1. Was
a couple places I think have him 10-1 now. It's crazy.
10-1. So we kind of, and just zooming out a little bit, we have a top 3, and I believe it's pretty much a consensus top 3 across the industry, or pretty close, which is Drake London, Treylon Burks, and Garrett Wilson. So Burks drops from 1 to 2 in our last update. He did have a disappointing 40 time, but something that you noted, Amico, like this is a pretty big dude. So for his size, the 40 time really wasn't, that detrimental.
Yeah, the 40, like if you're adjusting for his weight, is still like one of the best in the class, which is important to note. I mean, I think that, some of the other people, again, like Lance Zierlein, like he was noting like just the overall quality of the workout wasn't that good. And that might be worrying some teams. I think you mentioned like something about like maybe like having some issues with his weight earlier in his past and stuff like that. So like there's other things that we want to consider out of the workout, but yeah, like in terms of the speed, like I'm not really that worried. Like he has a couple like really high like mile per hour readings from in games, like GPS stuff, which is really cool. So I'm not really worried about like the speed. Like obviously you'd like to see it tested out well, but I mean a big dude like having like a bad start in the 40 isn't like the most surprising thing in the world. Like his flying 20, which is like the last 20 yards of the dash, were like still really good. So I'm not really worried about that. And actually, like one thing that I do want to mention about like the player comps and why I like them is just that like I do think it gives us like a pretty good picture. We're looking at this like statistically, but it's really interesting to me how in the comps you do tend to get a lot of players who are built similarly and who are, I mean, we're using weight as a variable, so the build is not super surprising, but like we are getting tons of players, mostly players, I would say, who have like similar athletic profiles, even though we're not including any athletic measurements in the data that we're using to create the comps. So that's something that I really want, I think, like our users to like really take away, and our readers to really take away from this, is that like we're not forcing anything. Like the data is creating these patterns and these comparable players for us. And I think like a big thesis that I'm kind of come away with through doing these is just that like certain kinds of players, certain kinds of athletic profiles, certain kinds of receivers, like they are going to do certain things on the football field. Like coaches are it's a pretty efficient market. Like they're pretty good at understanding how to deploy these guys. And as a result, like certain players put together certain kinds of, like certain types of players put together specific kinds of production profiles. And that's why we end up getting a lot of similar players that, like just through the data, even though we're not using those athletic measurables.
Yeah. And we get a boom bust profile in terms of Burks' comps. You have to like twist the knife as a Bills fan throwing James Hardy in here. I was so excited when they drafted James Hardy. I was like, they need this big receiver, like red zone threat. He caught like this touchdown in the back of the end zone, like very early in his career in a game against Jacksonville. I was so hyped up. But him, JJ Arcega-Whiteside, N'Keal Harry on the bottom end. On the high end, though, I mean, some pretty legit names: Calvin Johnson, AJ Brown, Mike Evans, Julio Jones. And again, that speaks to like this size of Burks. He's like, what's he like, 6'2", 225, something like that.
Yeah. And like, I mean, it's pretty easy to say like he's not going to be Calvin Johnson. But it's just like there's just not that many players in our database that are that big. So you naturally get like all these guys who are big, and he was productive. He's predictive and he's young. So like you get those guys in there too. So yeah, the ceiling on Burks is really nice. I don't think that enough people are talking about the floor. And maybe it's just like a little taboo to just like talk about like what could happen to these guys. But it's like, yeah, like, you know what, like athletically, like he does look a lot like N'Keal Harry, like I hate saying that out loud, but like, it's just true.
Yeah. And and we were talking about guys translating their game to the NFL level, like how they're going to win. Like Burks is interesting because he's a real big dude, but he played a ton of slot in college, which
Yeah.
to me, I feel like that's a good thing, like showing that versatility. Like I kind of want to see that, but it is, somewhat interesting. We don't know exactly how he'll be utilized at the NFL level. But he did have yards per team pass attempt greater than 3 the last 2 seasons. And I think like the bucket of guys at his size who have, 2 of those seasons is really, really pretty small. So that speaks to the ceiling that he offers.
Yeah, 100%. And, I think the other thing that's good with Burks is that we do get like some confirmation bias because some of the scouts, I would say the most popular comp in the scouting community has been AJ Brown. And he shows up in our comp list, which is always nice to see. So that's kind of an endorsement, I would say.
All right, let's go over to London. London also, a bigger wide receiver, and he was one of your combine winners because he weighed in at around 220. I think he was, previously we thought it was like around 210. So that was a pretty big win for him. His comps, I'm going to pull those up on the screen in a second, but Eric Dacker, Jordy Nelson, Devontae Adams, Michael Floyd, DeAndre Hopkins, Braylon Edwards, Justin Blackman, Devontae Parker, AJ Brown, and Mike Evans. Like you can kind of get a sense for the type of wide receiver he is when you look at those comps. I know where I've seen like the scouting people that are concerned is that he doesn't necessarily separate a lot. He wins with his physicality, and there's always some concern. Like, are you going to be able to dominate, physically when you're playing against NFL players versus college players?
Yeah, and honestly, the thing that I'd say to that is like I just don't know if that's necessarily true. Like I think a lot of people are judging separation based on like what they're seeing in like these highlight tapes and all this stuff where they see him making all these contested catches. But like to me, and I think like with some of the stuff that I've read, like definitely to some NFL teams, like creating separation at the catch point, which he does really well, like that's separation, like just because you're not like dusting a guy by 3 yards in a route, like that doesn't mean that you're not creating separation. So, London is a guy who dual sported with basketball up until his final season. So this is really like the first time he's focused fully on football, which is to me like something that I think only benefits him. You can already see it in the weight gain. And yeah, like he's not a tall, skinny dude. He's a little shorter. Like we thought he was 6'5", 210. He's really 6'4", 219. And that's a really huge difference in BMI. So if he can be a big ball winner, if he can be a guy who can score touchdowns for us, that's definitely gonna be good for fantasy. And that's what you see in a lot of these guys. Jordy Nelson, Eric Decker, like Mike Evans, like these guys love the end zone. So
yeah, you can see the heat map that you have in your prospect profile for him. That 2021 season, just, stark green across the board, 42% dominator rating, 3.26 yards per team pass attempt, 3.74 adjusted yards per play. So absolutely crushed it. And I'll bring up the comps that we were talking about. Again, like like a pretty strong set of comps. Even like Dacker and Jordy Nelson, who you see on the low end of these comps, and Devontae Adams, like they might have struggled like right out of the gate in terms of their rookie PPR points per game, but we know they had very successful careers.
Yep. Yeah, and it's worth noting with London that he played with both Amon-Ra St. Brown and Michael Pittman at USC. So he definitely had some target competition early. Actually outproduced Amon-Ra St. Brown last year. And, we already saw what he was in the NFL. So that, to me, that's a good signal.
Okay, so the guy we have third is Garrett Wilson out of Ohio State. I've seen he's the guy who's actually the betting favorite to go number 1 out of the receivers, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So why do you have Wilson third? And, the draft market right now looks like he's going to have the best capital of the group, even though it's probably going to be like somewhat immaterial because they're all going to go in the first round, we think. What's the reason for the discrepancy?
Yeah, I think Wilson is just like a little bit tougher to peg down in terms of like the fantasy production because he's a smaller guy. Like he's 183 at the combine. So right away, like you're kind of not expecting him to be like a big touchdowns guy. And I think that takes away like a little bit from some of the ceiling stuff. He is really athletic. He's really fast. So, if he comes out and he ends up being like, like a Will Fuller out of the gate or an Odell Beckham, like that's really good. But I think something that we've seen, and this is what I noted in the profile, like even like a lot of the successful guys, and this gets back to the archetype stuff you were talking about before, like even a lot of the successful guys that are in this like smaller category, like they haven't really sustained success for like a large number of years. Like, I mean, Odell's prime, I thought was really, really short, even though it was really good, obviously early on. Fuller's been injured a lot. Santonio Holmes, Greg Jennings, like those guys who were, I would say, positive comps for him, like they haven't really had more than like a handful of seasons between them of success. Like I think it's just more difficult when you don't have like that big frame, that 200 plus frame, to have year in and year out success. So we're dinging him a little bit for that. I do think that the comps probably cheat him a little bit just because, he played with Chris Olave. He played with, who's in this draft class and will go in the first round. He played with true sophomore Jackson Smith Najigba. I think I'm saying that right. Who's exceptional. Like he'll probably be the first receiver drafted next year.
So the guy who had the insane bowl game.
Yeah. The video game.
I remember him like breaking the DraftKings scoring.
Yeah. So I think like with a guy like Wilson, like I just don't feel as certain in like what we're projecting. So like I just naturally will have him a little lower than the guys like London and Burks, who I feel a little bit better about.
Yeah. The second tier of wide receivers that we have, Jameson Williams, David Bell, and Skyy Moore. Of this group, Moore is definitely the guy we're highest on relative to the market. His ADP on my fantasy league right now is wide receiver 10, and we have him wide receiver 6. But we saw some good speed from him at the combine, 4.41, which like we really wanted to see and was important for him. And he's an early declare from a small school, which is a little bit rare. So those are some positive signs in favor of Moore. Jameson Williams from Alabama towards ACL in the national championship game. He's an interesting case, Amico, and I wonder how you deal with this, where he doesn't have a big history of production, but his one season with Alabama was really, really good. He transferred from Ohio State, so they were pretty flush with wide receivers there.
Yeah, Jameson Williams is the guy that, I mean, he could move a bunch of different ways, I would say, between now and then. The big thing for me, first I want to know how he weighs in, because he weighed in 179 at the combine, but that's after having the ACL surgery and all that stuff. I'm assuming that that's not his actual playing weight. The Alabama Pro Days in a couple weeks, so I'd really like to see what he weighs in there. We didn't even adjust the profile after the combine, just because I just assumed that there's no way he's going to be 179 pounds entering the NFL. If he is, that's a huge red flag, because he's over 6 feet tall. That's not an optimal BMI. I don't really like the tall, skinny guys personally. I don't know. Maybe that's a bias, but I think that if you look that up, that's probably spot on. We know the speed's going to be there. I mean, he comes from a track family. He was a burner in high school, so I'm not really worried about the speed. But the career path is really interesting, because, like you mentioned, he starts at Ohio State. He can't get any burn at all in his second season behind Olave and Wilson. And again, we talked about kind of comparing that. It's an especially tough case, because I don't really trust Ohio State's Ohio State, I would say, generously, does not have a great history in terms of getting their talented players the ball as frequently as they should. We just saw this with Terry McLaurin, even Mike Thomas, didn't really see a ton of work until his final season. I think we just get a lot of weird profiles out of Ohio State to begin with. So he transfers, cool, goes to Alabama, absolutely crushes. And Alabama this year, they're not as good as they have been in the past in terms of the receivers, but they still have other talented players. John Mechie's going to be drafted. They have a couple guys that'll be in the mix next year. So, I tend to believe that he's probably pretty good. But then we also run into the issue of is that quality of play going to translate into fantasy production, because he does kind of profile as more of the, down the field burner types. And you see that in a lot of the comps. We have the Henry Ruggses, we have the Mike Sims Walkers, the Philip Dorsetts, the John Rosses, Diami Brown. If he's that kind of guy, then even if he's really good, unless he's Deshaun Jackson, we're not going to get the same. It's not going to be proportional, what he's worth to your NFL team versus your fantasy team. If you can be a guy like a Jalen Waddle who catches the ball underneath more and becomes more of a PPR guy, then we're going to be in good shape. But he wasn't really using that kind of role. So I'm not really positive that is going to happen. So I'm trying to be a little more optimistic because I think that like the player quality is good and there's like the Will Fuller outcome here in play. But I mean, he's going to be in the first round and he's really athletic. So I'm trying to be optimistic for now. And that's why he kind of sets it for us.
Yeah, he heads that second tier. Why don't you gush about Skyy Moore, who I brought up? And I think, like I said, as of right now, that seems to be our biggest differentiation from the market. We're going to want to see the draft capital, but it seemed like with the good combine stuff, you were thinking that he could like sneak into the second round, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's like locked in the second round, honestly, at this point. Like he was kind of on that fringe, I would say, entering the combine. Ran the 4.41 and just had a really good workout. I mean, he has huge hands, over 10-inch hands, which is something that teams definitely pay attention to. Has definitely translated to success in the past with other prospects. And a lot of the scouts I think just came away really impressed with the totality of the workout. Lance Zierlein was saying like he's not even really like a Skyy Moore guy, and he was like, it's really hard not to like this guy after seeing the workout, just because of the professionalism, the demeanor, really competitive. I mean, the dude is a receiver who wears 24. Like if that doesn't say baller, like I don't know what does. So, the statistical profile is very good. He is I think with the improving draft capital that helps a lot, and he's doing basically what Corey Davis didn't do coming out of Western Michigan, which is leave early. So that's good for us. Like I'm kind of hoping like that we're getting basically small school CeeDee Lamb. And if that's what we're getting, obviously this is a huge hit. But there's a bunch of other guys that show up in his range of outcomes that would be, sizable wins for us, I think, in fantasy, especially if we're talking about like rookie draft capital.
David Bell, the other guy in this tier, and like London, I think you had him on the combine winners list, with the plus combine weigh-in. Interestingly, both you and JJ Zachariason have Devonta Adams as one of the top comps for David Bell. But the athleticism seems to be concerned here. Thoughts on David Bell?
Yeah, I mean, he's just really productive. Like 3.2 adjusted yards per play last season. 2 years ago, he played like a handful of games with Rondale Moore, who went in the second round, and he outproduced him, especially in terms of touchdowns. Like this guy is legit in terms of his frame. You mentioned the weight for him as being a win, 212. So he can get in the end zone, which is really nice. The combine running, the 4.65 40, like it may hurt him in the draft, right? Like I think maybe he was more of like an early day 2 pick. Maybe he's more late day 2 now. I still don't really think that he's going to fall outside the top 100 picks. Obviously, if he does, we'll adjust to that. But, again, we talk about where players win. Like David Bell is going to be a slot in the NFL. He's going to, be winning with his route running. He's a PPR guy. Like it doesn't really matter what he runs. And you can't, I mean, I shouldn't say that. Like he was like a 5 flat or something, like we'd be concerned. But like a 4.65 isn't like sending me out the door because a lot of the other guys on this comp list also weren't incredibly fast at the combine and ended up being, pretty good players. You mentioned Adams. Adams is our top comp. Keenan Allen, Robert Woods. Like those are all, with the exception of Adams, I guess, because he can kind of do it all. But like guys you would think of as being able to win from the slot, being able to win with technique. I do think that's kind of who David Bell is. Now,
Dude, I got it.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I got to yell at you for your y-axis on the David Bell graph because you're making his floor is pretty good here. The 7.2s look low, but this is a pretty high floor, comparatively to some of the other comp sets we've seen.
Yeah. The y-axis is it's been a point of interest, I think, from a couple of our more visually minded friends. But I mean, the thing with the comps is like for me, like I want you to see the names and the rookie production is not like as important, right? But at least that's how I'm looking at it. But we can go back in the lab on the y-axis. That's not a huge
Okay, so those those clear top 2 tiers for us. We've got the full wide receiver rankings on site. I do want to ask you a couple more specific questions. One guy that we're low on is Chris Olave from Ohio State. He's actually the ADP wide receiver 4 on my fantasy league right now. So we're decently low on him. And I've seen some like back and forth on him where like he's one of those guys where it's how much do we ding him for that big non-early declare red flag. It does seem like the draft capital is going to be solid for him. Looks like he's going to be back into the first round right now.
Yeah, not an early declare, and he was the one I would say affected the most by the breakout of Smith-Njigba. So, not being kind of like the clear third best receiver on your team and also being the oldest and most experienced of those players is not typically a good thing. Now, if you look at like the profile overall, like just statistically, he looks a lot like Garrett Wilson. Like they have pretty similar career numbers. But again, like Olave is doing that with a fourth season. So I think when you start layering in that context, like he looks not as good. I think that it kind of narrows his range of outcomes. I don't think that like the ceiling is really high. And I want to find winners. Like to me in the rookie draft, like I want to find winners. Like I'm not trying to hit singles, especially not with guys that are going to be taken in the first round of rookie drafts. And like that's kind of where his ADP is now. So Olave gets a ding for me on that because I don't think that the ceiling is really there. I think the floor is decent. Like he's gonna play right away, and he can win down the field. He's fast. He was fast at the combine, so that matches up with kind of again like where he wins. But I'm just not really sure that like he's ever gonna be like a super meaningful fantasy player, and that I'd rather just like take a swing on some of these other guys. Like we have George Pickens over him. We have a couple of other guys that we mentioned. Like I'd just rather take a swing at those ceilings. Over Olave, who's like, I guess probably a little safer, like especially when you consider the draft capital, but just like not as good a ceiling and not as good a chance of hitting his ceiling as those other guys.
Okay, before we get out of here, I just made a super huge for those of you watching on YouTube. Got to zoom out. Two other questions before we get out of here. One, are there any guys that you see, like you mentioned Jameson Williams a little bit, but guys that could rise or fall a lot in your dynasty rankings based on the draft capital who kind of just have like real volatile draft capital, or maybe someone that's like outside of your top 5 right now that could vault up if the draft capital is surprisingly good? And two, just like you go through this process every year and I'm sure you undig like some hidden gems here and there. Anybody that sticks out to you that, it's maybe like a later round rookie pick that you're really rooting for?
So I think there's like 3 guys that I'm kind of looking at on the draft capital side of things. 2 of them are coming off pretty major injuries. So George Pickens, who I just mentioned, Justin Ross out of Clemson. Definitely different situations. Like Pickens tore his ACL last spring. And basically didn't play this year. Like he appeared in the last 4 games, but only had 5 catches. Like he wasn't really used. He was someone who was really productive early in his career. So I'm kind of just curious in general, like how big the NFL is going to ding him for the injury history. Last year, that was something that I thought really killed these guys in the draft. Terrace Marshall is a good example. Like he fell, like I would say, like a round further than I think a lot of people expected him to, because he had like some medical red flags. Is that going to impact Pickens? If it doesn't, and he goes like at the 1-2, round 1, round 2 area, maybe like in the 40s. That's pretty good. Like I'll feel a lot better about him, and obviously how the NFL feels about him. If he slips into the 3rd round, then I'm kind of like, okay, maybe we have to widen the error bars here and consider that his range of outcomes maybe a little wider. Ross is someone who was awesome as a freshman with Trevor Lawrence. Then he had like a really bad spine injury, missed an entire season. And so he does have the 4-year tag, but it's kind of like under very special circumstances. So I'm not really hitting him for that, but the early year production is really promising. This year he was hurt again, ankle issues, lower body issues. So I just want to see like, is the NFL valuing like the age 19 stuff, or are they like really worried about the medicals? And if they think that he can be really good, then I'm probably going to jump on that because I think that the upside is probably pretty significant with him, given what he was able to do early. I'm also kind of like secretly hoping he gets drafted by Jacksonville, but that's probably less likely since they just spent like $1 billion on Christian Kirk. And then the 3rd guy is Christian Watson out of North Dakota State. No injury, but FCS level prospect, was considered to be the best receiver at the Senior Bowl. and then performed really well at the combine. So we have him pretty low right now. That's someone that I'm probably already going to move up a little bit in our update. I'll probably do an update next week, and he'll come up a little bit. But if he can sneak into the first round, which like some people are talking about, then we have to like really move him up a good deal, because I think that the scouting community is kind of in agreement that like he has a ton of raw talent, but needs to be refined. Now, again, I don't love to hear that from a guy who's in his 5th season. It's not like my favorite line to read, but he's coming from a smaller school that is really run heavy, so you can see why that would happen.
Amico, you passed on a chance to explicitly say shower narrative with Justin Ross and Trevor Lawrence. I mean, you basically said it without saying it, but I mean,
well, listen, I mean, the shower narrative is mainstream, right? I mean, we have Waddle with Tua, we have Chase with Burrow. I mean, the NFL teams know this isn't this isn't a secret anymore.
Key input. The post-draft rankings will change quite a bit based on the shower narrative flag, like who succeeds and who doesn't. Okay, talk about Alec Pierce, the crush.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just really curious here how this turns out, because he's a really freak athlete. Was a high school volleyball player, a really good high school volleyball player, and all that athleticism showed at the combine. So, not like a guy I typically love to go after, but the thing about guys like Alec Pierce is, much like Nico Collins last year, these like really athletic guys who we assume like are going to get some kind of draft capital, like people just don't draft them because they're like, oh, like the production stinks. But you're getting a guy who's probably going to be a day 2 pick and has the requisite athleticism to be successful at a pretty good discount. So he's someone that I'm kind of just intrigued. Like I'm really just intrigued to see how high he actually goes. But if he ends up in a spot where he can get some targets, there's definitely a chance that we get kind of like an immediate payback there. I mean, Cincinnati is not like I know that they advanced like really far this year. They had a really good season. They had an NFL level quarterback in Ritter, but like it's not like they're like some powerhouse school that's traditionally producing like all these like star NFL players. So it would be really interesting to see kind of what he develops into at the next level.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Amico, for joining me. First off-season podcast of the season. Excited to get under the belt. As I said, next week I'll talk with Pat Kerrane. We'll look at the year 2 NFL players entering their sophomore seasons, kind of compare them with these rookie prospects that Amico just talked about. You can also find all of Amico's dynasty rankings on Established to Run. His prospect profiles, the dynasty ranks get updated every week. So whether your rookie draft is tomorrow or after the NFL draft, we've absolutely got you covered there. Please give us a like on YouTube, rate, review us on iTunes if you're listening to the podcast. It helps us to continue to do this podcast for free. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and see you next week.